Namo Ramana. A warm welcome to everyone for the Sunday Satsang. May I now please request Narayanji to initiate the puja. Narayanji.
Sudaya Namaha, Nandaya Namaha, Govindaya Namaha, Sukhambaranam Vishnu Shashivarnam Chaturvedam, Vasantavadanam Dhyaye Sarvabhuma Santi, Ayamutta Samsakrutu, Vandavakrantvayamutta Samsakrustu, Tadevaraganam Janmatadeva, Taraganam Janmatadeva, Vidyavanam Devavatadeva, Nishtupadeva, Om 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 Swamana, Om Jana Om Jana Om Satyam Om Satsang Bhagavan Bhargo Devasya Dhimhi Dhiyo Yo Na Prachodayat Om Abhajyota Samsam Savam Namapata Samasta Durga Tatara Alvesukita Krishnamanshikarna Nirvek Satya Bhakta Madhav Vigni Surjam Karshe Prithviya Virturi Suru Nandagurma Devda Prithvi Diyarala Devadita Vishnunathada Swajja Karikam Devi Putram Gurzasanam Agamartam Tu Devanam Abhinatam Tu Rakshasam Andaro Karamyado Devavana Madhyana Gopata Samasta Durga Tatva Amnitita Nirvinda Sukyatavada Vignesra Pujam Karshe Arananta Garbhachakum Navami Kavim Navina Om Sattva Jayasraja Brahmana Namaskare Aditya Buddhasi Sadhanam Asmikarjapinte Bhagavatyayami Mahaganapatim Avadayami Mahaganapatir Mahasam Samarpayami Om 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 Mahaganapatir Mahasam Yigno Vidatam Akshadam Samarpayami Om Mahaganapatir Mahasam Gandham Dharayami Samarpayami Om Mahaganapatir Mahasam Gandham Yakshadam Samarpayami Om Mahaganapatir Mahasam Alnaratam Akshadam Samarpayami Om Mahaganapatir Mahasam Samarpayami Om Mahaganapatir Mahasam Pushpai Pujayami Om Sumudaya Namaha Om Ekadantaya Namaha Om Kapilaya Namaha Om Gajagarnagaya Namaha Om Lambodharaya Namaha Om Vigadaya Namaha Om Vighnarajaya Namaha Om Vinayakaya Namaha Om Dhumagedave Namaha Om Ganapakshaya Namaha Om Malakundaya Namaha Om Gajananaya Namaha Om Vakrutundaya Namaha Om Surpakarnaya Namaha Om Hiranyaya Namaha Om Skandagurdhavaya Namaha Om Siddhavinayakare Namaha Om Shankara Moksha Vinayakare Namaha Om Atipurappane Vinayakare Namaha Om Mahaganapatiye Namaha Nanavida Parmana Patra Pushpani Samarpayami Dhupartam Samarpayami Samarpayami Om Bhur Bhuva स्वाहा प्राणाय स्वाहा हमारे स्वाम ज्ञानाय स्वाहा उदानाय स्वाम समानाय स्वाम रुद्राय स्वाहा महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः प्रकटकर्कण्यं समर्पयामि देवदेवायं समर्पयामि अमृतोपसं समर्पयामि कर्पूरं समर्पयामि गणानां वारं समर्पयामि नीराजनं समर्पयामि नीराजनं ब्रह्मास्मनीयं समर्पयामि स्वाहा ब्रह्मणे स्वाहा महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः महागणपतिये नमः वक्रतुण्ड महाकाय नमः ओम 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 जन ओम तब ओम सत्यम ओम तत्सर्वोर्यं भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात् ओमावतीर्थं सर्वं नमोपाध्याय नमस्त रुद्र कैकमरा परमेश्वर चित्तम सुबह सोमने मूर्ति आद्य ब्रह्मण नित्य प्रार्थे देवेदे पराह प्रभे वैवस्वत मन्वन्तरे अष्टाविंशतितमे कलियुगे प्रथमे भागे जम्बूद्वीपे भारतवर्षे भरतखण्डे मेरो दक्षिणे पार्श्वे सगास्ते अस्मिन् वर्तमाने यावाविषये नववादिनां षष्ट्या संवत्सराणां मध्ये प्लवनाम संवत्सरे दक्षिणायने वर्ष ऋतु कन्नी मासे कृष्णपक्षे षष्ठीतिथ्यां शुभदितो भानुवासरयुक्तायां रोहिणी नक्षत्रयुक्तायां शुभ नक्षत्र शुभ योग शुभ कर्ण एवं गुण विशेषण विशिष्टायां अस्यां षष्ठीतिथ्यां शुभदितो मम जन्म पाप जन्म प्रति एतद्पर्यन्तं मध्ये संभाविधानं सर्वेषां पापानां सत्यानुनाथम् अस्माहं सहकुर्बाणं क्षेमसद्धर्य वीर्यविजय आयुरारोग्य ऐश्वर्येण अभिवृद्ध्यर्थं समस्तमङ्गलाभ्यर्थं समस्तदुर्दोषान्तयार्थं रमणमहर्षे प्रसादेन ज्ञानवैराग्यसिद्ध्यर्थं रमणमहर्षे पूजां करिष्ये तदङ्गं कलशपूजां करिष्ये विघ्नेश्वरं यथास्थानं प्रतिष्ठापयामि सोमनाथे क्षेमाय पुनरागमनाय च कलशस्य मुखे विष्णुकण्ठे रुद्रसमाहित मूले तत्त्वसिद्धितो ब्रह्मा मातुमने समुद्रा समुद्रा कुशं सागरा सर्वे सप्तद्वीपसमुद्रा ऋग्वेदो यजुर्वेदो सामवेदो तैलधर्मणा गंगे सैन्य गोदावरी सरस्वती नर्मदे सिंधु कावेरी जलेस्मिन् सन्निधिं कुरु अङ्गै गङ्गा सर्वे गङ्गानुगमा आयातिदेव पूजार्थं दुर्गशङ्कारदा अंबुरा सागरत्नो विष्णु विष्णुकरे देवे से पुण्यसिद्धये भाग्यमेन नमोस्तुते देवो देवालय प्रोक्तो देवो देवस्नान अज्ञाननिर्माणं तोयां भवने पूजे ओम सकल गुणात्मक शक्तियुक्ताय योगविदात्मने नमः आधार शक्तिये नमः मूल प्रकृतिये नमः आदिवराय नमः आदिगुरुवाय नमः आनंदाय नमः लक्ष्मीये नमः आदित्यादि नवग्रह देवताभ्यो नमः दशदिक्पालिभ्यो नमः गुरु ब्रह्मा गुरु विष्णु गुरुदेव महेश्वरा गुरु साक्षात् परब्रह्म तस्मै जय गुरवे नमः ओम अस्ति श्री ब्रह्मा विष्णु महेश्वरा ऋषिरिक्किजित् सामधर्माणि सन्धांसि सकल जगत् सिद्धति संहार कारणी प्राण शक्ति परा देवता आप बीज हरि शक्ति ओम कीलकम प्राणाष्टाम्ने विनियोग ओम अंगुष्टाभ्यां नमः हरि तर्जनीभ्यां नमः ओम मध्यमाभ्यां नमः ओम अनामिकाभ्यां नमः हरि मध्यमाभ्यां नमः ओम कर्णपुष्टाभ्यां नमः ओम विद्याय नमः हरि सरसे स्वाहा ओम शिवाय वसत् ओम कौसाय हरि नेत्रदाय वसत् ओम मस्तकाय पर पूर्ववत्संगी विपत्त ज्ञानम रक्तांबोधिस्तबोधोरस तरुणसोडकराब्जे वासं बोधनं विक्षुप्तं गुणं पंचमाना नित्यानसो कवालं चलेन सीता पुनवसोलोट्या देवी काला गौना बहुसुंदरी पार्थिव ओ महामणिं क्रम क्रोमणिमं अम्यं लं लं ओम सम हम सोह सोम हंस अस्यामूर्तो देवदृष्टो अस्यामूर्तो सर्वेन्द्रियाणि वाङ्मनस्पस्सस्वत्र दिव्या प्राणवाणि आयुष्टानि याकस्ति प्रतिगुणं दृष्टन्तु स्वाहा ओमस्य श्री प्राणकृष्णामृतस्य ब्रह्मा विष्णु महेश्वरा ऋषिर्गिरिसामनर्वाणिसंधाम सकल जगत्सृष्टि सम्मानकारि प्राणशक्ति परार्धेन आमीय हरिशक्ति लोकीर्णं प्राणकृष्णाते नियोग आमनोस्ताभ्यां नमः हरिशक्तिभ्यां नमः लोकदिमाभ्यां नमः आमनामिभ्यां नमः हरिकृष्णाभ्यां नमः लोककृष्णाभ्यां नमः आम विद्याय नमः हरि स्वाहा ओम शिवाय नमः आप कौसाय हरि विद्याय ओम वस्त्रदाय पूर्व संधि निबंध असुनीदे पुनरस्माक्ष सक्सपुर प्राणे देवोगम लोकस्य में सूर्य चंद्र प्रमदे मण्यान स्वस्ति आवाहिदो भव सत्ताविदो भव सन्निधो भव सन्निधो भव अवगुण्डितो भव सुब्रतो भव सुप्रसन्नो भव सुभो भव वरदो भव प्रसिद्ध ब्रह्म स्वामी सर्व जगन्नाथ यावत् पूजावधानकम् तावत् गुरुत्मा वेद गुरु नमो भगवते श्री कुशेलाय नमो भगवते श्री कुबेराय नमः नमो भगवते श्री कुशेलाय नमो भगवते श्री कुबेराय नमः नमो भगवते श्री कुशेलाय नमो भगवते श्री कुबेराय नमः चतुर्दोषि मंडन पौलसी कुल सर्पः लक्ष्मी प्रसिमानमद ईश्वरा I will recite the Monostotra. श्री गुरुभ्यो नमः गुरुर्ब्रह्मा गुरुर्विष्णु गुरुर्देवो महेश्वरा गुरु साक्षात् परब्रह्म तस्मै श्री गुरवे नमः अपार सच्चिदुपवारि दाशोर्यशोर्मिमात्रं भुवनं समस्तं उदायिदं तं प्रब्रह्मवीरं चिन्ताविहीनं निर्विचिन्तयामि ॐ महोसेन महोंसेन जाताय नमः ओम श्री रमणाय नमः ओम गुरवे नमः ओम अखंड संविदाकराय नमः ओम महोजसे नमः ओम कारणोद्भवाय नमः ओम जगत्पितावताराय नमः ओम श्री भूमिनाथास्तुतिदाय नमः ओम पराशर कुलोतंसाय नमः ओम सुंदराकदवत्तराय नमः ताय नमः ओम सयायाम्बा सयायवते नमः ओम शोणासुर महोदीन मानसाय नमः ओम स्वर्णस्तगाय नमः ओम श्रीमद्वादशांग महास्त्रे रक्त विद्योर्याय नमः ओम महाशक्तिवादेन प्रवृत्ताय नमः ओम परमार्थविदे नमः ओम दिव्याय नमः ओम पितृप्रदान वेशिने नमः ओम हिंदुमोदिना पितृवे नमः ओम पितृराजेष्ट सोनदैव प्राप्ताय नमः ओम तपोमयाय नमः ओम उदासीनाय नमः ओम महायोगिने नमः ओम महोत्साहाय नमः ओम कुशाग्रदिये नमः ओम शांतसंकल्प संप्रभाय नमः ओम सुन्दुसे नमः ओम सवित्रे नमः ओम स्थिराय नमः ओम तमस्वीर सर्वंगाय नमः ओम बुल्लाभूज विभूजनाय नमः ओम चंद्रिका सदा श्री मंडितान्य मंडलाय नमः ओम सूर्यवाट्यां समासीनाय नमः ओम सूर्यदाचल विप्रभाय नमः ओम वेद वेदांत तत्पन्नाय नमः ओम चिन्मुद्रणे नमः, ओम त्रिगुणाधिकाय नमः, ओम विरूपाक्ष गुहावासाय नमः, ओम विराजत जलाद्भुते नमः, ओम दीप्तनयनाय नमः, ओम पूर्णाय नमः, ओम रसिदासतांडवाय नमः, ओम कबीराय नमः, ओम परमाचार्याय नमः, ओम सुप्रसन्याय नमः, ओम अभयप्रदाय नमः, ओम दक्षिणासीनिवाय नमः, ओम धीराय नमः, ओम दक्षिणाभिमुखाय नमः, ओम स्वरागे नमः, ओम महर्षिये नमः, ओम भगवते नमः, ओम गीत्याय नमः, ओम भूम विद्या विशारदाय नमः, ओम विमलाय नमः, ओम दीर्घदर्शने नमः, ओम आप्ताय नमः, ओम दुर्मार्ग प्रदर्शकाय नमः, ओम समत्रुसे नमः, ओम सत्यत्रुसे नमः, ओम सत्याय नमः, ओम प्रशांताय नमः, ओम अमित विक्रमाय नमः, ओम कुमाराय नमः, ओम सदानंदाय नमः, ओम मृदुवासिने नमः, ओम दयानवाय नमः, ओम श्री सोमनाथ निकेतनाय नमः, ओम सत्तरसनो महेश्वरे नमः, ओम पंचुताय नमः, ओम गणेश मुनिकेश सेविता कुसुरुवाय नमः, ओम गीतोपदेश सारा ग्रंथ संसिद्ध संशयाय नमः, ओम वर्णासुर मदादीनाय नमः, ओम प्रसन्नाय नमः, ओम संपत्याय नमः, ओम आत्मवते नमः, सर्वात्मस्थानां आराध्याय नमः, ओम सर्वसद्गुणिने नमः, ओम आत्मारामाय नमः, ओम महाभागाय नमः, ओम मातृमुक्ति विदायकाय नमः, ओम विद्याय नमः, ओम विनुदाय नमः, ओम विप्राय नमः, ओम मुनीन्द्राय नमः, ओम भावगोज्वलाय नमः, ओम दक्षिणार्थसम्मार्णे नमः, ओम मौनेर स्वात्मबोधगाय नमः, ओम नित्यानिवर्तानित्याय नमः, ओम स्मरणात्मकमोदगाय नमः, ओम मंदस्मिर झंडांशवे नमः, ओम संसारतारकाय नमः, ओम सोनाद्रि दस्युति विष्टवे नमः, ओम आत्मविद्या प्रकाशकाय नमः, ओम अभिच्युत प्रज्ञाय नमः, ओम नैसर्गिक महातमसे नमः, ओम कपिलुदराय नमः, ओम सुप्रगौरवसनाय नमः, ओम गुहाय नमः, ओम दंडमाने नमः, ओम कृपापूर्णाय नमः, ओम पौरोग पिशत्पराय नमः, ओम स्कंदाय नमः, ओम देवतमाय नमः, ओम अमर्तयाय नमः, ओम सेनानिये नमः, ओम पुरुषोत्तमाय नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचल श्री रमणाय नमः, नमो भगवते श्री कार्तिकाय नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री गुरुराय नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री वल्ली दैवाने नमः, नमो भगवते श्री सुब्रह्मण्याय नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री स्वामिनाथने नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री दक्षिणामूर्तिये नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री नटराजने नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री भैरवने नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री नंदीमहेश्वराय नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री शिव पार्वतीये नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री शिव पार्वतीये नमः, ओम नमो भगवते श्री शिव पार्वतीये नमः, ओम नमः शिवाय नमः, ओम नमः शिवाय नमः, ओम नमः शिवाय नमः, ओम 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 शिवाय नमः। उपदेश सारम अक्तुराज्ञया प्रापदे फलम् कर्मणि परम् कर्मदज्जनम् कृति महददो पदनकारणम् फलम् शाश्वतम् ईश्वरात्मिदं नेचयाकृतं सिद्धसोदकं मुक्तिसाधकं कायवाङ्मन कार्यमुत्तमं भूजनं जप चिन्तनं क्रमा जगतैषधी युक्तसेवनम् अष्टमूर्तिदेवपूजनम् उत्तमस्तवा दुर्जमन्तद सिद्धजं जप ध्यानमुत्तमम् आद्यधारया शोधशासनम् सरलचिन्तनम् विरदरबरम् वेदभावना सौमित्यसौ भावनाभिधा भावनी मदा भावशून्यस भावसुस्तुति भावनामला भक्तिरुद्धमा तिरुस्तलेमन स्वस्थता क्रिया भक्तियोग बोधार्थ निश्चितम् वायुरोदना दीयते मन ज्ञानभक्षिव योगसाधनं सिद्धवायव सिद्धिक्रियायुगा साधयोर्द्वयी शक्तिमूलगा लयविनाशने उभयरोधने लयकदं पुनः भवदिनोऽमृतम् प्राणबन्धना दीनमानसम् एकचिन्तना नासमेत्यद नष्टमानसो कृष्णयोगिन नित्यमस्ति स्वस्तिदं यद दृश्यवारिदं चित्रमात्मन चित्वदर्शनं तत्त्वदर्शनं मानसं तुदि मार्गणे हृदे नैव मानसं मार्गार्थवा वृद्धयस्वहं वृत्तिमाश्रिता वृद्धयो मनो विद्यहं मन अमयं कुतो भवति चिनवद ऐपदभ्यं निजविचारणम् अविनाशभा यमहं दया स्फुरदीयस्वयं परमपूर्णस इदमहं वदा अभिज्ञबन्धम् अहमिदीनके अभ्यल्लसत्तया विक्रयेन्द्रिय ज्ञानदीगम नामसेकस गज्जडं शेष ववासिका विश्ववेदरा नद्गया इति चिद्गयान ईसजीवयो वेशदीबिदा सत्स्वभावदो वस्तु केवलम् वेशानद स्वात्मदर्शनम् ईशदर्शनम् स्वात्मरूपत आत्मसंस्थिति आत्मदर्शनम् आत्मनिर्भया आत्मनिष्ठता ज्ञानवर्जिता अज्ञानहीनति ज्ञानमस्तिं ज्ञातुमन्तरं किं स्वरूपमे आत्मदर्शने अव्यया भवा पूर्णसिद्धं बन्धं यदि संवरं सुखं विन्दधीयहि वस्तुदैविक अहमवेदनं निजविभानकं महतिदं तवो रमणवादियं महतिदं तवो रमणवादियं महतिदं तवो रमणवादियं नमो भगवते श्री रघुनाथ। Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Raghavate Shri Raghavate. Om Namo Bhagavate Shri Raghavate Shri Raghavate. Hari Om. Hari Om. Hari Om.
Namo Ramana. In continuation of our satsangs for the 42 select verses from Bhagavad Gita, we are again joined today with Shri Raghav Kumarji, a long-time devotee of Bhagavan and a resident near the ashram in Tiruvannamalai. Today we will be discussing shloka number 9 and 10 after a brief recapitulation of the first 8 shlokas. A brief background of Shri Raghav Kumarji. He is a devotee of Bhagavan Sri Raman Maharishi with a background of Vedanta study under various acharyas of Rishikesh and Uttarkashi over several years. After completing a degree in technology in 1993 and a few years of research in electronics, he was drawn to the exclusive pursuit of the path of self-enquiry. He was blessed to be closely associated with the Ramakrishna mission, Arshavidya tradition, and the Adi Shankara Brahma Vidya Peeth Uttarkashi. Since 2001, he divides his time between Uttarkashi and Tiruvannamalai. He occasionally shares what he has learned from the acharyas with fellow devotees. Before I request Shri Raghav Kumarji, I would also request the devotees to please share any questions or queries either through YouTube or through the Zoom, or as they do sometimes on WhatsApp directly with me. All these questions shall be shared with Raghavji. Raghavji, can I please request you to take over? Raghavji, you are on mute.
Thank you, sir. Namaste. Today we continue our study of the Gita Saraha, which is, as we saw, the 42 selected verses from the 700 original verses of the Gita. And we saw a certain flow in these shlokas selected by Bhagavan. This time I thought I would mention to you that there is a publication by Shri Ramanashramam on these selected verses. Perhaps if some of you are interested, you could get a copy of that. I have one with me, which I shall show to you. So it is this little book here. You will be seeing it mirror imaged, but it's just a small booklet containing the basic word meanings and also helpful for chanting. You can keep it very handy. I'm reminded of an anecdote from Bhagavan's life that Bhagavan would peruse the daily newspaper for just a short but very focused while. And so any devotee or one or two devotees who wanted to, have their newspaper received from Bhagavan's hands would first make sure that the newspaper was received by Bhagavan. Bhagavan would then carefully go through it, then fold it back immaculately without even any sign that it has been read. He would fold it back, and then the newspaper would be read by the other devotee who wanted to get that paper. And the devotee writes in one of his reminiscences that it was always nice that the newspaper went through Bhagavan's hands and has reached us. Now here, in the case of the Gita, is much more than a newspaper. And this is the most profound darshana or vision of Atma and Ishvara being one. And this version or this darshana is being first taught by Krishna and then passing through Bhagavan's hands and reaching us. So the Gita Sara has this additional advantage for us devotees that it is doubly blessed, coming from Gita, then passing through Bhagavan's per usual, as it were, and then reaching us. So in the short compass of 42 shlokas, what Bhagavan has done is to first create the context in the first 3 shlokas. As we saw, the first shloka shows how Arjuna was very vulnerable and therefore open to the instruction of the Guru. The second and third shlokas give you the big picture. The Kshetra and Kshetrajna are the 2 universal categories and enfolding all of creation. So these 3 shlokas give the overview of what the whole knowledge of the self requires, what it takes. So after that, Bhagavan indicates in the third shloka that indeed is the jnanam, which is the right discernment between the kshetra and kshetrajna. So these 3 shlokas, like I said, give you that big picture of first the openness of the disciple, told in the first shloka, selected by Bhagavan. Sanjay uvacha tantata kripaya vishtam ashtrupurna kulekshanam vishidantamidam vakyam uvacha madhusudanaha. Then the second and third, Shri Bhagavan uvacha idam kshetram kaunteya idam shariram kaunteya kshetramitya vidiyate etadyovaittam prahuhu kshetrajna iti tadvidaha kshetrajnam chapimam vidhi sarvakshetreshu bharata kshetra kshetrajyor jnanam yatta jnanam matam mama. So in this compass, we are told that indeed is jnanam, which is the discernment between the kshetra and kshetrajna. Not any other knowledge of anything related to the details of the kshetra, but rather to see that the kshetrajna is different from, separate from the kshetra. Not just that, the kshetra has no independent reality apart from the kshetrajna. So I, the self, is the originator, the cause of all that exists. That is the vision Bhagavan unfolds in these 3 shlokas. Then in the fourth shloka, which Bhagavan has chosen to represent the quintessence of the Gita, there is the Mahavakya. Mahavakya unfolds, as I said, the oneness between the individual and the total. Ahamatma Gudakesha Sarvabhutashaya Sthitaha Ahamadischa Madhyancha Bhutanam Antayevacha. So the first line of this quintessential shloka talks of the consciousness available for experience in each individual sharira. And that same consciousness is not different from that which is the origin of the whole universe. That is the samashti, the collective level, is also from that same consciousness. So that is why Bhagavan selected this shloka to represent the Mahavakya, the quintessence of the entire Gita. After these 4 shlokas setting the big picture, what is kshetra, what is kshetrajna, what is the jnanam that all of us need to acquire or arrive at, then the Mahavakya, and finally the next 6 shlokas Bhagavan has selected to unfold the nature of the self. These verses, remember, are not really intellectual knowledge. Rather, they are verses which directly unfold the Swarupa of Atma. If we receive these verses as Guru Upadesha and carefully dwell upon them, they have the capacity to put the mind into self-inquiry directly. So the mind receives the verses as revelatory verses, words which directly tell you that consciousness that you are independent of what is experienced, that consciousness that you are is not bound by time and so on. We will just look a little more at that. So these 6 shlokas after the first 4 deal with this nirupanam of the Atma. What is the self? Beginning from verse 5 to verse 10. So 6 will be those shlokas there. In this, what did we see earlier? We saw that first Bhagavan has chosen the shloka where you have Jatasya dhruvo mrityuhu dhrum janma mritasya cha tasmad apariharyertye nattam shochitumarhasi. So Bhagavan says, look, this jnanam is that which if you attain, you will get that higher perspective where you don't grieve. So he tells this as an injunction. One doesn't grieve when gets that knowledge. And we also saw that the case of Atma Jnana is very unique in the whole compass of human knowledge, because any other knowledge doesn't give you freedom from sorrow. One remains what one is, and then one gets some knowledge or the other. On the other hand, Atma Jnana is this very special, blessed knowledge where that knowledge itself liberates, that knowledge itself gives freedom from sorrow. Remember, the word moksha is conventionally understood as freedom from birth and rebirth, but a more appropriate connotation of that word moksha is freedom from all limitations of sorrow, of being this limited being. You can see this word understood in this sense more easily available for appreciation in the case of the jnanis and the avataras. For them, just being born is not a cause for sorrow. Being in a body, as it were, doesn't create any sorrow. For them, all that exists is the self. So whether the body exists or doesn't exist is not of consequence for them, which is why the real or innermost meaning of the word moksha is freedom from all limitations. And this knowledge gives that freedom. And we also saw how Bhagavan unfolds the next few verses, indicating that the self is free from the 6 changes that are the lot of every embodied entity. Every entity is first born, then it exists for a while, then it starts growing, then it decays, and then it dies. In the middle, there is also a viparinama, metamorphosis. So these 6 changes are described, the Shad Bhava Vikaras. And we also saw that Atma is free from these 6 vikaras or Shad Bhava Vikaras. Bhagavan Krishna has mentioned them in the form of the key words Ajo Nitya Shashrato Ayam Purano Nahanyate Nahanyamane Sharire Nahanyate Hanyamane Sharire. So in this way, the self is appreciated as that unchanging substratum of the basis, which is what makes all the changes evident. If the self were also to have been changing, no change can even be appreciated. Only when there's an unchanging meter or a basis, then alone changes can be appreciated. You can look at how, if you had, let's say, a measuring tape, which itself is changing, you would never know for sure whether something else is changing or not. You have to axiomatically have one unchanging meter or rule with which you measure other changes, which is why this self, which is unchanging, is used to notice, to become aware of all that is changing. So the self is therefore free from all these 6 different types of changes. Not just that, we also have this very meaningful verse, Achedyo Yamadakyoyam Akledyo Shoshe Evacha. So there you have Nitya Sarvagata Sthana Rachaloyam Sanatanaha. In that shloka, Sri Krishna Bhagavan says that all these 5 elements cannot touch the self. 4 of the elements are given for illustrative purposes, that the self cannot be cleaved by any earthly element, achetyaha, adakyaha, it cannot be burned, and so on. And we had seen how even the akasha tattva, this element called space, is untouched by any of the other 5 elements. So whenever we are going through any challenging situation, that is where we have to bring in these words or these instructions of the Guru, that I remain rooted in the self and I do my best. I'm very objective. At the same time, that conviction is what I have to bring in to bear upon each situation, that none of these elements and their transformations can really affect the innermost self, which is the truth, which is me. We also had then the next half of that very shloka explaining that anything that you do cannot help you attain the self. Anything that you try to accomplish by actions also doesn't apply to the self. And we saw the 4 types of actions, which are: 1, you produce something new, like producing a baby, for example. A baby is produced afresh, as it were, from nothing, as it were. Then there is something called uh, apyam. Apyam means that which is attained by movement in space. So even that movement in space is not there. When the self is all that exists, everywhere the self is there. Consciousness doesn't exist in one place and doesn't cease to exist in another place. So there is no apyam or paraptihi either. There is no production for consciousness. There was never a moment when I was not. This very truth sometimes is mind-boggling, that as one is, even now, each one of us is immortal. There is no such thing as death for the I. All that is changing is just pertaining to the kshetra. Similarly, there is no prapti or apti. Apti is to attain it. One can move from one point in space to another point in space, but consciousness knows no movement to be attained. Similarly, you have no vikara. Vikara is any modification. So you can modify something like milk into curds by curdling it, by putting a sample of curds in it. No such transformation, which is irreversible, also happens for consciousness. Consciousness is free of the change called vikara. And finally, you have what? Apti, Utpadyam, Vikaryam, and Samskaryam. Samskara is purification. We also saw how there is no real purification for consciousness. It's only the mind that needs a certain frame of purification, a certain degree of purification. The consciousness, which is always pure, ever shuddha, doesn't need any samskara or purification. So in this context, there is a fine dialectic. We saw dialectic means 2 ideas which are equally correct, but they need to be carefully understood. One is that if we say no purification of mind is required, that would be incorrect. Only in the pure mind, that Brahma Jnana, that consciousness is all that exists, that knowledge can arise. At the same time, if we say that more and more purification is required, this is a never-ending story, which is why we also saw Bhagavan upfront prescribes or instructs the disciples into Jnana Yoga. There is no excessive focus on trying to be more and more pure. I am always impure, I need to become more pure. Such an idea is not in consonance with Advaita, which is why this idea that I am sinful, etc., is not in keeping with the spirit of Advaita. Advaita always says you are ever pure. And yes, we have some issues in the mind, we deal with them very objectively. Without denial, we are trying our best to see that the mind is in keeping with the truth. That is a fair way of saying it. But the never-ending quest for Antakaran Shuddhi too is another pitfall. Even while we do not deny that the mind is the instrument of knowledge. Then the next shloka, something important, Bhagavan Sri Krishna mentioned, that avinashi tad vidhi yena sarvam idam tatam vinasham abhyayasyasya nakaschit kartum arhati. So he says, Bhagavan says, tad vidhi, you should know that knowing is a definite process that happens. You arrive at that knowledge. It's not as if already that knowledge is there everywhere. Otherwise, there would be no striving, no need for instruction of the Guru. So one has to be very careful not to jump the levels, as we call it. So we have to work through the Vyavaharika realm. We have to work through where we are, be honest about it, be honest that yes, I am identified now and then at least with the mind, with the ego, and then see where one is going wrong, where there's obstructions are there. And by working on those emotional issues, those obstructions, we are able to remain as we are. So that knowledge happens in and through the mind alone. At the same time, at the conclusion of that knowledge, it is not something you describe, something you objectify. That knowledge makes you remain as you are. So the mind resolves in its own source. Unlike other types of knowledge, where the mind objectifies various things, here the mind resolves in its own source, which is consciousness. So this is therefore a very strange situation. The acharyas in our tradition, which have therefore given us these two ideas, manasa eva idam aptavyam, which means through the mind alone one arrives at knowledge. It's not through something else. Knowledge is not sitting somewhere out there and the mind is totally irrelevant. That's not the case. Manasa eva idam aptavyam. And yet we also have the important idea, yato vacho nivartante aprapya manasasaha. So from there, the mind returns along with speech, unable to objectify it. So these two ideas have to be carefully understood. Through the mind alone, we get the knowledge. At the same time, the mind cannot objectify the Atma because it is the very cause, the very substratum of the Atma, of the mind. So consciousness being the very substratum of the mind cannot objectify it. These two ideas have to be carefully looked at. When Bhagavan says, Tad vidhi, know that Atma to be you, which is free from space and time. So we have two very profound words used in these verses. Nityaha sarvagataha. The word nityaha is often used somewhat casually to say eternal. But what is it to be eternal? The mind cannot conceive of this word eternal in an objectified conceptual way, the way we can conceive of various other objects. We normally think of eternal as something that persists in time for a long time, like mountains or the rivers. But here the word eternal, nityaha, directly is a synonym for Atma. It is a word which directly denotes Atma. It's not a description or an adjective for Atma. Bhagavan has, in fact, written a very meaningful verse on this idea of Atma being free from time. In the Saddarshanam, I always find that particular verse very powerful. Bhagavan says, Bhutam bhavishyatcha bhavat svakale tad vartamanasya vihaya tattvam hasyan kimsat yatabhavicharcha vinaykasankam gananeva loke. So in the 17th verse, if I remember, Bhagavan says that Bhutam bhavishyatcha bhavat svakale. All that is past and all that is in the future is experienced as present alone. In other words, whenever we say past, we think of the past. We think of some event which has already occurred. When does that thinking happen? It happens in the present moment alone. So all thoughts of past are actually directly experienced only in the present moment. And what about when those events were actually directly experienced? Well, that was present as well. When any event was actually experienced, that was the present moment then. And now when we think of that event, we are thinking of that event also in the present moment. Therefore, all that is past, which is known as past, is just the present alone. It is subsumed in the idea of this present moment awareness. Similarly, all that is called future, that is denoted by the word future also, is thought of in the present moment alone. That present moment consciousness, through the agency of the mind, conceives and plans and calculates about the future. So when we try to imagine the future, we are doing that imagination also in the present moment. Then again, when that future event is actually experienced later on after a year or any duration of time, Again, it is experienced as the present moment alone. So all which we call future, whether we think of the future or whether we actually experience that future event, is all in the present moment alone. So everything happens in the present moment alone. That's a profound truth that indicates that the present alone is real. The present alone is the basis, the truth of all time. All time is thus collapsed into the present moment awareness. And now, if we look at what is this present moment awareness, Bhagavan says it is just timeless awareness. The present moment is actually timeless awareness. This single verse of Bhagavan has been expanded into a huge book, which is an international bestseller, The Power of Now. And Bhagavan has, for us, for our edification, encapsulated that entire teaching in that single verse in the Saddarshanam. This is the word Nityaha in Bhagavad Gita, that the essence of time is timeless awareness. That timeless awareness, which is you, which is I. So when we say Nityaha, it means that consciousness, which is I, is timeless. It is not something that is in time. We say time is in consciousness. In fact, time is consciousness. Just as we say, the pot is made of clay, the pot is clay. Even so, time is consciousness. The essence of that time is timelessness. When we appreciate this notion that we are in time gets so much attenuated, gets so much resolved, diluted. So in dhyana as well, this idea of aham nityaha, that I am timeless awareness, can be the very theme of that vichara. This word given in the Gita and also explained by Bhagavan in Saddarshanam. Nityaha aham nityaha. Then we also have another equally beautiful and profound word, sarvagataha. In fact, in this next shloka, we will see that word in more detail. Before that, we have a very important and yet cryptic shloka, which we will read or we will recite today, which is today's fresh shloka. Nasato vidyate bhavo, na bhavo vidyate satah, उभयोरपि दृष्टोऽन्तः स्वनयोस्तत्त्वदर्शिभिः न सतो विद्यते भावो न भावो विद्यते सतः उभयोरपि दृष्टोऽन्तः स्वनयोस्तत्त्वदर्शिभिः. This verse is again from the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, the 16th shloka. Bhagavan has selected this shloka continuing that unfoldment of the Atma Swarupa. Remember the scheme here, the first three shlokas setting the context and the big picture, and the next 6 to 7 shlokas explaining the nature of Atma. What is the Swarupa of that Atma? This shloka is in that portion of Bhagavan's selection. This shloka says, Na asato vidyate bhavaha. That which has no independent reality doesn't even exist. Asataha is that which has no independent reality. What does that mean to say independent reality? Whenever we think of any object, if we look closely at that object, we will find that it is made of something else. For example, a pot is made up of clay. And if we examine what clay is made up of, it is made up of further constituents like molecules of clay. In this way, as we go on analyzing what any object is made of, we find that it resolves in the form of one irreducible truth called Sat. So all that is Asat, is dependent reality. Because when we think of any object, it is found to resolve into something else. An object is found to have no existence apart from its constituents. So the pot has no independent existence apart from clay. It is therefore regarded as asat. The word asat means not absolutely unreal, rather, it means that which depends, which borrows its reality from something else. When we see a cinema on a cinema screen, all the different objects which we see have no independent reality. So notice here how we are experiencing these objects, and yet if we look at what that object is actually in front of us, we find that it is just projected on that screen. That screen alone has reality. So these objects or pictures projected on that screen are called asat. So Bhagavan Krishna to here he says, Na asato vidyate bhavaha. These objects or entities which you see around you have no independent reality. Then what is real? Na abhavo vidyate satah. So there is something called Sat, Bhagavan says, which has never non-existence. It never ceases to exist. So this is a very cryptic kind of shloka, that what you experience is actually not real, as it were. And then there is something called Sat they are telling us. So what is that Sat? This cryptic shloka therefore needs careful looking at our lived experience from moment to moment. Whenever we experience any object, such as a stone or a tree, Krishna says there, we have two buddhis or two types of experience which are collapsed into one, which are presented together for our experience. What are these two buddhis? One is the object, and the other is the very isness or existence. So when we say the tree is, we have the tree buddhi, the name and form of the tree is called forth. And then there is also the is, the word is, which is normally taken to be a verb, is here in Krishna's vision and in Bhagavan's reiteration of that, that is word is actually the substantive, it is a noun. So we are normally used to thinking of the word is as a verb, but here it is revealed that if you look carefully, it is that is which is the substantive, which is what always exists. When we say tree is, the nama and the rupa, the name and the form, belongs to the word tree, no doubt. But the real stuff, the real upadana, there belongs to the word is. When you later experience another object, that other object, like a stone, is. There again, that stone is just a name and form, and the basic stuff, the real material there, so to speak, is the isness. So every name and form, every object you experience has this isness, which is taken for granted. What our acharyas are asking us to reverse that gaze, reverse that vision, and pay attention to just the isness, ignoring the nama and rupa. When we notice that the isness is constantly there, it never goes away, it is never displaced. When our experience of one object is gone and the experience of another object sets in, the nama and rupa have changed, but the isness continues. The same isness continues. That continuity is what is known as Sat Buddhi. That Sat Buddhi is the continuous experience of existence. Nama Rupa keeps changing, that Sat Buddhi continues in and through all these objects, all these experiences. So that Sad Buddhi has no non-existence. It never ceases to be. So this is a very profound discovery, because we take for granted the isness and pay all our attention, get attached, get involved, enmeshed in all these nama rupas. When the instruction of the Guru is thus received by us, we turn or shift our attention to the isness underlying all the nama and rupas. This shloka is reiterating that very idea. Nasato vidyate bhavaha. These nama rupas, these names and forms such as tree and stone and so on, they keep changing. They have no independent existence. They have borrowed their existence temporarily from that sat, which is the isness. Why do they appear real temporarily? Because they have borrowed their existence. Like this famous comedy scene where there is a man who appears rich because he has borrowed a car from his rich friend. He is actually in penury, but he can borrow certain things temporarily, but they don't actually belong to them. Even so, these namarupas, all objects that we experience, have borrowed their existence from that underlying sat. That sat is that existence which lends its existence, which lends its reality to all these namarupas. Therefore, that sat, na bhavo vidyate asta, na sato vidyate bhavaha, na bhava vidyate sataha. Of that sat, there is never non-existence. It always will be, it was, and it is. And that Sat is identified with Atma. That Sat is not out there. It is not somewhere apart from you. It is the Atma Tattva. It is the very consciousness that is always available for experience. That is you. That is the essence of the I. Bhagavan has one small conversation which I thought I'll share with you in the context of this shloka. In the Upadeshasaram, we have various entities described as Asat. We have the shloka, Vigrahendriya Pranadhitamaha Nahamekasat Tajjadam Yasat. So one disciple asks Bhagavan in this context one question. I will share with you what Bhagavan's response is. The question is, how come Bhagavan, if everything is Sat, then why do you say that the body is Asat? Why do you say that all these different entities are Asat? If that Sat alone exists and that Sat alone is always there. So this is the context. Let us read this conversation. A visitor said, all are said to be Brahman. Master said, yes, they are. But so long as you think that they are apart, then they are to be avoided. Avoided means they are not real. If on the other hand, they are found to be the Atma, there is no need to say even all, because all that exists is only Brahman. There is nothing here besides Brahman. Then the disciple asks Bhagavan, see, the Ribhu Gita speaks of many objects as unreal, and then finally at the end it says that they are all real. They are all Brahman and thus real. So Bhagavan says, yes, that is true, because when you see them as so many, as multifold, they are asat, that is unreal. But when you see that they are Brahman alone, then they are deriving their reality from that substratum, which is Brahman. Then the disciple goes on to ask, why then does the Upadesasara also speak of the body, etc., as jada or insentient? Bhagavan answers, inasmuch as you say that they are body, etc., apart from the self, and the self is found in this body, but when the self is found, then this body, etc., also are found to be in it. In other words, when the body is seen to be apart from the self, it is asat, unreal. On the other hand, when the self is discovered, those very entities which are dismissed earlier as unreal now are recognized as sat, being of the same essential nature as Atma. So please note here how first the jnana has to arise. Only then we validate these namarupas as Brahman. Sometimes the mistake is made of prematurely trying to validate, oh, all that exists is Brahman. That is the fruit or the result of knowledge. So first is to avoid, in the sense, negate all these namarupas as a sat and arrive at Atma Jnana through self-inquiry. After that alone, we can say all this is Brahman, all this is real. The pitfall in prematurely validating the namarupas is then one can go on pursuing them. After all, we are pursuing Brahman, right? So that's a pitfall. We have to be careful. First, dismissal as asat. Bhagavan uses the word, they are to be avoided. The avoiding here is not in the form of running away, but they are discerned as unreal. After that, the jnana has to arise through self-inquiry. Only post-jnana, so to speak, these other entities are validated as not separate from Atman. That is the sequence. Which is why only at the end, the validation that all this is Brahman is done, not prematurely. Otherwise, all that is required for Atma Vichara, such as pursuit of a certain discernment and not needlessly getting enmeshed in these asat nama rupas, that never is going to happen. If we go on only validating everything as Brahman, there is never an opportunity to discern what is the Atma Tattvam. So that's a careful delineation required, and Bhagavan points that out here. After Jnana, then they are validated as Brahman, not before. So in this shloka, Sri Krishna Bhagavan also reiterates this very idea. And then he goes on to say that Ubhayorati drishto antaha, the one who knows the essence of these two realities, the Sat and the Asat. One who knows that all that is Asat is in truth, not separate from that Sat. One who knows this, antaha, antaha means the ultimate end, the ultimate reality of them. He has discerned what is their status. They alone are the Tattvadarshis. So only the Tattvadarshis are able to do this delineation. Tattvadarshi means the knower of the truth. Those knowers of the truth alone are able to see this very conclusion. Antaha is conclusion of what is real and what is unreal. This very shloka is reiterated by Bhagavan even in Saddarshanam, the very first Dhyana shloka, the profound and extremely important shloka in Saddarshanam is the very first one. We can just look at that as well in this context to see what Bhagavan has said in the context of Sat Buddhi and Asat Buddhi. Bhagavan too says, Sat Pratyayaha kin vihaya santam hridyesha chinta rahito hridakyaha katam smaramastamameyamekam tasya spratir tatya dridhaiva nishtha. So the Sat Pratyayas, whenever we say this object is, that object is, the Sat Pratyayas, Kim Vihaya Santam, do they have any existence apart from that isness? The Namarupas are merely superimposed. That isness alone is real, Bhagavan says there. All that is Asat, the Namarupas. The same idea of this shloka of the Gita, Bhagavan has explained there in the first shloka there. Katam ahridyesha chinta rahito hridakyaha. So this is very relevant in terms of sadhana. Hridi yesha, in this heart, in this center of one's being, chinta rahito hridakyaha, when all the other involvements with these namarupas resolves, then one is already at one with that beingness. So how do you arrive at that Sat, which is the basis of all these different namarupas? Not by another thought, not by another specific objectification. So in meditation here, it is not another specific vritti related to some object. Instead, it is chinta rahitaha. So there is no involvement with other thoughts. Instead, it is chinta vihinaha. Chinta here means not just thoughts, but it means that the mind resolves into its source. There is no particular objectification. In the traditional acharyas, texts of the traditional acharyas, they use the word that there is no phalavyapti. Phalavyapti means no objectification of this knowledge can ever happen. This very idea Bhagavan says here, that we just remain as aham, we just remain as the Atma. There is no objectification. Therefore, that smriti, that continuity of meditation of Sat implies that one remains as that Sat. Instead of saying, I know the Atma, which is incorrect, we say, I am Atma, aham Atma. That idea is the consequence. Okay? We don't actually verbalize there in meditation, in self-inquiry, but just remaining as the self is itself the smritihi. The smritihi means recollectedness. Recollecting the self is to just remain as the self. That is the idea expressed in this shloka of Saddarshanam. In the next shloka in the Bhagavad Gita, which is, like I mentioned, the last shloka, explaining the nirupanam or the nature of the self, explained through so many words. We have the culmination of the topic here. Please remember that when it comes to any object in this srishti, we have various descriptions of this object. So many adjectives are possible. But when it comes to Atma, the words are not adjectives. Instead, we say that they are the lakshyartha. They give us the lakshyartha, meaning by indirect implication alone, these words lead us into Atma. They don't objectify Atma, these words, but they push us, as it were, inwards to rest as Atma. That is known as the lakshyartham of a given word, not the literal meaning of the word. The literal meaning may imply something like a concept. So we are not trying to form another concept of the Atma. We already have so many concepts related to the world, and we don't burden the mind with more concepts of the Atma. Instead, we declutter the mind. These words of the Acharya, when properly understood, actually get rid of the cluttering of the conceptual structures that are there in our mind, through which we analyze and experience the world. Instead, all these overlay, all these needless ideations are removed, and one arrives at the Atma. Timeless awareness gets rid of the notion of time and past and future. We come back to the Atma. This next shloka completes this topic, and we will read it. Yatha sarvagatam saukshmya akasham nopalipyate sarvatraavasthito dehe tathatma nopalipyate. Yatha sarvagatam saukshmya akasham nopalipyate sarvatraavasthito dehe tathatma nopalipyate. So this is the 10th shloka in Bhagavan's selected verses from the Gita. It is also in the second chapter of the Bhagavad Gita. It is the 16th, this is in the 13th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita and the 32nd shloka in the 13th chapter. Here, Bhagavan says that although the Atma, the self, is present in all the living beings in the Buddhi Guha, it is still untouched by whatever the individual beings do. All actions done by these jivas, these loci, as it were, of consciousness, do not affect that consciousness. The consciousness remains untouched by it, even as space is untouched by all that it accommodates. Yatha sarvagatam saukshmyadakasham nopalipyate. Sarvagatam means all-pervading. Just as space is all-pervading, there is no concept possible of somewhere where space is not. Space is there everywhere by definition, as it were, and it is very subtle. Therefore, it is not smeared. Upalipyate means smeared by anything that it accommodates. So if different smells are there in the air that flows through space, those smells do not affect space. Similarly, any explosion is there where Prithvi Tattva gets destroyed. Different material is born or destroyed, space remains the same. It accommodates all that exists and is not afflicted, smeared, or stained by whatever it accommodates. Even so, that is the analogy for consciousness. Even so, sarvatravasthito dehe, in all shariras, in all bodies, this Atma obtains, and yet it is na upalipyate, it is not stained or smeared. As uh, human beings, we go through so many experiences, and yet that conscious principle within is unstained. While this is actually a very powerful idea, our elders and acharyas were careful to give it only to those who already had a good deal of commitment to ethics and dharma. Would you know why? Because the truth is, even the right and wrong actions done by a person do not affect his innermost core. This idea was never told prematurely to someone who is not yet established in ethics and morality and dharma, because they can easily misuse that idea to do what they like and say Atma is unaffected. The statement is true, however, it is not honest. When someone who is identified with the body and mind makes that statement, I am consciousness unaffected but by what I do, it's not fully honest, but it is still true. And at some point, one has to make that quantum leap into owning up that knowledge. So Bhagavan, by his grace, treats all of us as adhikaris. We are fit to own up this profound statement. No matter what actions have occurred through the body and mind, I am unstained by all those actions. I am untouched by all those actions. Why? Because I am not the doer. All doing happens as it were. All doing is similar to breathing, for example. Although it's okay to say I breathe, it's also equally valid to say breathing occurs. When I sleep, breathing happens, even throughout the waking state. Breathing is allowed to happen. I can control it, of course, by my free will, but breathing occurs. Even so, effortlessly, all actions do happen in and through the body and mind. This is the vision of Bhagavan, this is the vision of Lord Krishna. That kartrutvam, the sense of doership, also is not real. And where there is no kartrutvam or doership, there is no enjoyership or there is no bhoktrutvam. So we are not affected by the results of those actions as well. So when I'm not the doer, I do not partake of the results of those actions either. That is the very profound vision of taking Arjuna to a higher level altogether, to the Paramartha level. So, as I said, the Paramartha level is valid between a Guru and Shishya, not in casual conversations. In casual conversations, we should stick to the Vyavaharika level, such as saying, yes, I do this or he did that. But when a Guru is instructing the Shishya, or when the Shishya is applying the Guru's instruction in his life, he is trying to embody the teaching, then the Paramartha level is very important. We have to bring in that Paramartha level. I am not the doer. Therefore, I am not the enjoyer as well of those results of the actions. I am reminded of a very, interesting anecdote, which is like an inside joke with the sadhus in Rishikesh and Uttarakashi. They say that on the festival of colors, the day called Holi, where everyone indiscriminately, applies these colors on each other, the sadhus there also do intermingle. They have their cottages quite close to in proximity with the other householders and other lay folk. And yet the lay folk are careful not to apply the colors on the sadhus because they are, not really part of the lay society. They have their own sadhana. Out of respect for the sadhus, they are not inundated with these colors. But before doing that, these boys there in these places where the sadhus live, these little boys and youngsters, they, to test the sadhus, throw a few notes of currency, maybe 100 rupee note. And when the sadhu is passing by, he looks at that 100 rupee note and he has two choices. Either he picks up that note or he chooses to ignore it because he's a sadhu. He's not supposed to, take initiative for money. Money may come to him. He's content with what destiny brings. Now, let's say he takes initiative to pick up that note. He bends over and takes it. Then immediately the boys say, Swamiji, if you do this, you're going to be inundated with colors. You have done this, and so here you go. And they are applied with colors. Where there is kartrutvam, doership, there is enjoyership. That is the idea. If that sadhu takes initiative to do something, pick up that note, then he has to suffer the consequences. He will get the colors. If the sadhu is royally, majestically walking without bothering with those notes, then he is free from enjoyership. He is not stained or smeared by any of those colors. So only if we have the doership sense, then we have to suffer the consequences. Those two go together. That vision is unfolded in this shloka. We will look at this particular idea and the next topic as well in subsequent sessions. We will end with the Shanti mantras. Om Sahana Bhavatu Sahano Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavadhitamastu ma vidvishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Ishvaro Gururatmeti Murti Veda Vibhagini Vyomavatyapta Devaya Dakshinamurtaye Namaha. Vande Shri Ramanashe Rajaryasya Padacham Yomi Darshayadisham Bhantam Dhantamaditya. Thank you. We shall meet again next month. Thank you, Anuragji. Please take over.
Raghavji, thank you once again for a very, very enlightening session. Should any devotees like to put a question to Raghavji either through YouTube or through Zoom, please feel free to do so. You are also welcome to send such questions later through email or SMS or WhatsApp or any other channel that you may prefer. I'll wait for 10 seconds before I would request Narayanji to initiate Akshar Manamalai in case anyone has any questions. Narayanji, please take over and Akshar Manamalai, and followed by Aarti. Narayanji?
Okay. ஆழ்வழி சுந்தரம்பு அகமும் அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அகமுருதி அகமுலை சீரையாய் அமர்வித்ததென்கொள் அருணாச்சலா ஆருக்காயனை ஆண்டனை அகற்றி இளம் அழுதிடும் அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா இப்பழித்தம் உன்னையே நினைக்கின்றாய் இனியாருள்வார் அருணாச்சலா ஈன்றிடும் அன்னை தெரிதருள் இதுவோ உனதருள் அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா உன்னையே மாற்றி மூடாதுலத்திலே உறுதியாயிருப்பாய் அருணாச்சலா ஊற்றுற்று உணர்ந்திடாதுனை கண்டு அழகை காட்டருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா என்னை அழித்திற் போதும் என்னை கனவாவிடு இதுவோ ஆண்மை அருணாச்சலா ஏனிந்த உலகம் என்னை திரளுக்க இது உனக்கழகும் அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா ஐம்புலகழுவன் அகத்தினில் புகுவோர் அகத்தில் இல்லையோ அருணாச்சலா ஒருவன் உன்னை ஒளித்தவன் வருவான் அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா ஓங்காரம் ஒரு உயர்வில்லை உடையார் அறிவார் அருணாச்சலா அவ்வை புலனும் அருளை தந்துதனை ஆழ்வது உன் கடன் அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சல சிவ அருணாச்சலா அருணாச்சலம் வாழி அன்பர்களும் வாழி சரவண மாலை வாழி வாழ்க சுயம் பிரகாசம் வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சூழ்க சுத்தாத்ம சக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே வாழ்க சுயம் பிரகாசம் வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சூழ்க சுத்தாத்ம சக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே ஏழுலக ஜீவன் முக்தி இன்ப பொங்கவே ஏழுலக ஜீவன் முக்தி இன்பம் ஓங்கவே இதயமாகும் இறைவனாது எல்லாம் ஓங்கவே இதயமாகும் இறைவனாது எல்லாம் ஓங்கவே பாழ்மனம் அகந்தை வாழ்வு வாழ்பொழிகவே பாழ்மனம் அகந்தை வாழ்வு வாழ்பொழிகவே பரமசச்சிதானந்தாத்ம பால்பொழிகவே பரமசச்சிதானந்தாத்ம பால்பொழிகவே வாழ்க சுயம் பிரகாசம் வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சூழ்க சுத்தாத்ம சக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே தட்டிலாத நித்திய ஜீவம் தத்துவமோகவே தட்டிலாத நித்திய ஜீவம் தத்துவமோகவே தன்மயத்தி சின்மயத்தழைப்போகவே தன்மயத்தி சின்மயத்தழைப்போகவே எட்டு திக்கும் அம்ச சோகம் எதிரொலிக்கவே எட்டு திக்கும் அம்ச சோகம் எதிரொலிக்கவே எல்லாம் பிரம்மம் என்னும் உண்மையில் இருக்கவே எல்லாம் பிரம்மம் என்னும் உண்மையில் இருக்கவே வாழ்க சுயம் பிரகாசம் வாழ்க வாழ்கவே சூழ்க சுத்தாத்ம சக்தி சூழ்க சூழ்கவே அம்சசோகம் அதுவே எல்லாம் அம்சசோகம் ஓம் பூர்வஸ்வः भर्गो देवस्य धीमहि धियो यो न प्रचोदयात् देवदर्शनं प्रसन्नामि अमृतं स्वाहा ओंकारे स्वाहा अपारे स्वाहा ओम दाने स्वाहा ओम समाने स्वाहा ओम ब्रह्मणे स्वाहा अरुणाचलनाय नमः अरुणाचलनाय नमः अरुणाचलनाय नमः पुरगंड गोतीरं निवेद्यं समर्पयामि मध्ये मध्ये पानीयं समर्पयामि अमृतोपचारं समर्पयामि नीराजं समर्पयामि नीराजनानन्तरम् आस्मन्यं समर्पयामि हरि ओम हरि ओम जीवन समाहित नागवल्ली कलियुगं कर्पूर सूत्र संयुक्तं प्रतिधाम कर्पूर नीराजनं ब्रह्मपरिशुद्धि समर्पयामि ओम नमो भगवते श्री अरुणाचलनाय नमः अरुणाचलनाय नमः अरुणाचलनाय नमः लोकाहं पुष्पं वेदां पुष्पवान् प्रजावान् तस्मात् चन्द्रमावां पुष्पं पुष्पवान् प्रजावान् नमो भगवते श्री रघुनाथ श्री रमणाय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री रघुनाथ श्री रमणाय नमः। ओम नमो भगवते श्री रघुनाथ श्री रमणाय नमः। ओम नमः शिवाय नमः। ओम नमः शिवाय नमः। ओम नमः शिवाय नमः। ओम शिवाय नमः। ओम शिवाय नमः। ओम शिवाय नमः। चिदानंद रूपम शिवोहम 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 चिदानंद रूपम शिवोहम शिवोहम
Namo Ramana. A very warm thank you to Raghav ji and Narayan ji, Rajesh ji at the Kendra. This brings us to the conclusion of the Sunday Satsang. We shall reconvene on the second Sunday of October. Namo Ramana.